Thank you so much for having me. Um, can you guys hear me understandably?
Yes.
Okay, it doesn't sound too muddied or anything. If so, if it is, I can go get a headset, but okay. All right, in that case, without further ado, I understand you guys had a somewhat Ukraine-themed Shabbat a couple weeks ago. I apologize for not being able to make it. But in my defense, it was at about 2 a.m. my time. Um, and I didn't have these lovely prepared remarks for you at that point. So let's get started. So Shabbat Shalom, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Joel Wasserman. I grew up in the shul, and I'm currently located in Lviv, Ukraine. I'm gonna make sure, okay, so that I know that I can see people. I relocated here from my home in Kyiv about 1 month before the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. I'm going to talk for a bit about what I'm doing here, what my story was and is, what the situation is like here, and about topics relevant for Jews here in Ukraine. After that, I will open it up to questions. I've been interested in this part of the world for a long time. I studied Russian in college, and I did a study abroad in Moscow in the summer of 2012. I decided then that I wanted to spend some time living in the Russian-speaking world, but those plans changed in 2014 when the Ukrainian people forced out an exceptionally corrupt, Russia-backed aspiring autocrat for his Russian-directed crackdown on a protest movement, angry over a decision not to sign an association agreement with the European Union. Right after this revolution, known as the Euromaidan Revolution or the Revolution of Dignity here in Ukraine, Russia invaded and annexed the Crimean Peninsula, and within a month and a half, Russian paramilitary, intelligence, and other forces began storming Ukraine's eastern borderlands and industrial heartland, a region called the Donbass. I decided I didn't want to live in Russia, and that instead I wanted to make myself useful somehow here in Ukraine. I eventually figured out that what I wanted to do in Ukraine after graduating college was, I eventually figured out what I wanted to do here in Ukraine after graduating college. I spent some time working as well as taking classes on English teaching at Montgomery College before moving to Kyiv in March 2018 to teach English with organizations working with veterans of the war in Donbass and their families. I finished my time with the organization I was working with at the end of last year, and I was in a bit of a holding pattern, deciding what lay ahead for me in Ukraine. I had been paying attention to the reporting on the Russian buildup around Ukraine's borders, and I was worried about what Putin had in store. I had read compelling, well-reasoned arguments from experts on both sides of the will he or won't he invade debate. But at the end of January, actually a few hours before the US embassy told people to begin leaving the country, I decided that the risk was significant enough that I did not want to be in Kyiv for a while. Leaving in late January allowed me to take all of the stuff that I wasn't okay leaving behind for the Russians, to have my pick of apartments, and to take my cat. Pretty much every Ukrainian I know was caught entirely unprepared for the war. It was very frustrating to have to convince my girlfriend, Katya, that I wasn't just being anxious, that my government wasn't just playing games, and that there was a significant chance that Russia would try to destroy her country. Her mom was even less inclined to believe me, and my girlfriend actually got angry with me when I tried to explain in frank terms what I feared laid ahead in the next few months, because it made her mom lose sleep. It really remains incredible to read how so many people in Ukraine were caught totally unprepared for the Russian attack, despite a massive escalation in Russian provocations, despite Putin's recognition of the independence of the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, and despite the closure of Ukrainian airspace. Ukrainians were caught by surprise for a few reasons. Number one, They didn't believe Russia would actually try to attack the whole country, both because they felt that despite the Donbass war, Russia was still close to them, and because they thought that Putin would be incredibly stupid to try to take over the whole country. Well, as it turns out, Vladimir Putin thought that Russia was so close to Ukraine that Ukraine's existence as a separate country and people was essentially a profane accident of history, and that matters had reached a point at which Ukraine's drift away from its big brother was simply intolerable. Furthermore, it turned out that Putin was indeed delusional and stupid enough to try to take over the whole country. They believed that number two, they believed that all the noise around the war was some kind of provocation or scheme being carried out by the big countries, and they would naturally resolve it themselves. Katya, my girlfriend, repeatedly asked me in the month before the war whether this could all just be some sort of big game. Number three, the Ukrainian people have faced a tremendous amount of trauma over the course of the past couple generations. They faced the social, political, and economic consequences of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the plundering of their country by oligarchs and criminal gangs, the trauma of the repression against the Maidan movement and the war started by Russia, and the social and economic consequences thereof. People had spent their lives building up their little corners of this world for themselves and their families. The prospect that there would be some sort of force majeure that erased all of it in an instant was simply too painful to contemplate. And it was far easier to tell themselves that everything would work out in the end and be all right. Given how the American people have responded to the crises we've been through over the past few years, I'm not sure one can say that we, as the American people, would have behaved so differently from the Ukrainians. War came on February 24th. I did not sleep on the night of the 23rd. Katya had been with me in Lviv for most of that month, but went back to Kyiv early on the morning of the 23rd to try to convince her mother to leave. After the closure of Ukrainian airspace and the reports I had read of Russian forces advancing to points where the next stop was across the border, I was fairly certain that that was the night it was going to happen. Putin finished his address declaring the beginning of Russia's special military operation, as they call it, at around 5:45. And I began seeing reports of explosions in Kyiv shortly thereafter. I had not expected them to hit Kyiv so soon. I debated when to call to wake up my girlfriend and her mom, because on the one hand, the city was now in grave danger. And on the other hand, I knew that they needed sleep before the beginning of one of the worst days of their lives. Thus began a tremendously nerve-wracking day in which I was anxiously following the news of the opening battles of the war and waiting for news of when Katya, her mom, and her mom's husband would get out. I was terrified that the Russians would soon encircle the city and seal it off. The person that Katya and her mom had agreed to leave with in the event of war decided not to go. Katya went to her friend who had a car, but she and her husband decided to wait one more day before heading west. For a while, I was in total despair because Katya was trapped in exactly the situation I had warned could come with no way out. Miraculously, a few minutes before she was going to give up for the night, she found a bus heading west to the Carpathian Mountains, and she got aboard. 26 hours later, after a journey which would usually take around 8, she arrived at a hotel my parents booked for her in a resort town called Yaremchi. 2 days later, I was able to convince her mom to get on a train to the same place. They are both safe. They were safe, and they remain safe today. Katya remains with me here in Lviv, while her mother and her husband just got on the train back to Kyiv this morning. The situation in Lviv and throughout the west of Ukraine remains fairly calm. The past few days have seen a significant increase in air raid sirens, which theoretically could happen at any second. But the last time the Russians tried to hit Lviv itself, the city's air defenses shot down their cruise missiles. There are occasional strikes on the city itself, but they are almost exclusively confined to infrastructure sites like power substations, fuel facilities, and train stations, which one would expect an enemy to try to hit in times of war. This is as opposed to cities further east, where the Russians have hit unambiguously civilian targets with their missiles. For what it's worth, I don't think the Russians have enough missiles to waste on Lviv to put me in much danger here. And there is no danger of the enemy being able to even threaten the city with ground forces. Life goes on here. The restaurants are open. It's legal to buy beer and wine again. Katya and I have taken several trips outside of the city to neighboring Western regions. Food supplies in the stores are good. Fuel supplies at gas stations are not. The world's attention has moved on from the initial peak of interest in Ukraine, and this shows up in the stocks available at humanitarian centers in the city. When I visited about 1 month ago, volunteers were running low on donations from food drives in Europe and were having to purchase food items for refugees on their own dime, or their own hryvnia, as one might say. I am afraid to say that most of the big international aid organizations have not made themselves very useful here, with the notable exception of the World Central Kitchen, run by famous Washingtonian restaurateur, and one of my personal heroes, Chef Jose Andres. You would expect that aid stations would be able to give out big bags with flour, buckwheat, cooking oil, canned meat, and other staples provided by someone like the International Committee of the Red Cross. You would be disappointed. The most effective responses to both humanitarian and military needs here in Ukraine have been from ad hoc, grassroots level volunteer networks. My Facebook feed is littered with people fundraising to buy drones, bulletproof vests, tourniquets, hemostatic bandages, night vision optics, and encrypted radios. Katya herself has been collecting and sending medicines and medical supplies to hard-hit areas since the first days of the war. I am incredibly proud of what she's been doing for her fellow countrymen and women, and of how Ukrainians have stepped up for each other in their nation's darkest hours. If you are interested in supporting these efforts, please contact me after Shabbat. The lands that now make up Ukraine were at the heart of Ashkenazi Jewish civilization. My great-grandmother was born in the town of Stry in Lviv region. I actually have a stone from the foundation of her house. I forgot to bring it with me out here, but it's in my bedroom. I have other ancestors from the town of Drohobych, also in Lviv region, and from Mohyliv-Podilsky in Vinnitsa region across the border from Moldova. Many of you likely have ancestors who came from what is now Ukraine. Lviv, also known as Lvov, Odessa, Dnipro, formerly known as Yekaterinoslav, and Kiev were all known as very Jewish cities. As you also know, these lands used to be a very hostile place for Jews. Many of our ancestors fled the pogroms encouraged by Tsar Alexander III of Russia. The Russian Civil War saw even more pogroms. Then, when World War II came, the Nazis and their collaborators killed almost every single Jew on the territory of Ukraine who had not managed to flee before their arrival. Even after the war, Soviet Ukraine was a virulently anti-Semitic place. I'll give you an illustrative example. There is a giant open-air ethnographic museum right outside of Kyiv called Pirehov. It contains folk architecture, arts, foods, and crafts from every area of Ukraine, stretching over dozens of acres. It's a popular place to take your kids for a day trip. Well, the reason that it exists, and the reason that similar places exist in other Soviet countries, former Soviet countries, is that the Soviet government wanted Ukrainians to understand that they were real people with history and heritage, that they were true members of this brotherhood of nations that was building socialism together, that Ukrainians were not rootless cosmopolitans, unlike some people, the Jews. Thus, Let's just say there are no shtetl exhibits at Pirahova. Lovely place. You wouldn't know there were Jews in the country, though. Ukraine remains a rather interesting place to be a Jew. The people known to Ukrainians as freedom fighters who battled for a free Ukraine against the Soviet Union are known by historians and International Jewish Society as Holocaust collaborators. Right across the street from Babin Yar, the site in Kyiv where 30,000 or so Jews who remained in the city, when the Nazis captured it, were all murdered in a giant ravine. Right across the street from that complex, there are monuments to Ukrainian nationalists, who essentially served as the Nazis' gauleiters, or civil administration, early in the occupation, at least until the Nazis got tired of their embezzlement of resources and shot them, hence the monuments. There is a statue to a woman named Olena Telicha, who Ukrainians know as a patriotic poet, but who historical scholarship knows as an open admirer of Hitler and Mussolini, who with her husband co-published a collaborationist newspaper, which encouraged Kievans to turn in their Jewish neighbors. Lviv is the capital city of Ukrainian nationalism, and people still openly wave the flag of the nationalist Ukrainian insurgent army, which fought against the Soviets. 70% of its officer corps came from the auxiliary police formations, which assisted the Nazis in carrying out the Holocaust in Western Ukraine. Stepan Bandera, the top leader of the Ukrainian nationalist underground during and after World War II, was a virulent anti-Semite who commanded a movement that was happy to assist the Nazis in cleansing the territory that they wanted for their Ukrainian ethno-state, cleansing it of Jews, Russians, and Poles. One of the main narratives Russia uses to justify its invasion of Ukraine is that they are denazifying the country. Given all the things that I just described, you may wonder to yourself, are they actually wrong? Well, yes, they are. I will explain why. You have probably heard that Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who was elected with an overwhelming 73% of the vote in the second round of the 2019 presidential elections, is Jewish. You may have seen reports about Ukraine's Jewish community standing in full support of their country's sovereignty and freedom. They have indeed. Despite the best efforts of the Nazis and the Soviets, and despite massive Jewish immigration around the time of Soviet collapse to the United States, Germany, and Israel, there is vibrant Jewish life here. During the war, I've gone to a Purim party and a Pesach seder. There are Jewish aid organizations working in Lviv. The Jewish community mobilized heroically to deliver its most vulnerable people to safety in the West and across the border. It is also worth noting that of all the things that I told you about the Ukrainian nationalist movement and the Jewish people are essentially unknown here. People have heard claims about nationalist collaboration with the Nazis, but they dismiss them as Moscow propaganda. Even educated, progressive, cosmopolitan people. I know leaders in the Ukrainian LGBT community here in Ukraine, and I remember them posting on Facebook with genuine confusion as to why Israel would be offended by Ukrainians having marches in honor of Stepan Bandera on his birthday. The Ukrainian nationalist movement's legacy here is one of freedom and resistance, not ethno-nationalism and genocide. What's important to understand is that without the Tsars, without revolutionary or reactionary ideologues in power, blaming Jews for their problems, without the top-down endeavor, which has so long existed in this country, in this part of the world, to demonize and marginalize Jews, baseline anti-Semitism in this country is quite low, especially in comparison to the rest of Eastern Europe. When authority isn't telling people to hate Jews, people generally don't hate Jews. Now, the baseline anti-Semitism here is more than many American Jews would likely feel comfortable with, but it's not enough to have suffocated Jewish life in this country. Even more important to understand about even more important to understand about Russia's denazification is exactly what they mean by it. It is critical to realize that both here and in Russia, the reason people abhor Nazi Germany isn't because of the Holocaust. It's because the Nazis brutally invaded and occupied here. You have to understand that during the Soviet Union, the Holocaust as such essentially didn't exist. During Soviet times, the memorial at Babin Yar made no mention of the fact that the site was a place where genocide against Jews took place. Memorials there and at countless other places where the Nazis rounded up and murdered local Jewish populations, they only commemorate peaceful Soviet citizens. When Jews tried to publicly commemorate the massacre of their people at Babin Yar during Soviet times, they were repressed. There was no genocide of the Jews. There was only Nazi brutality against the Soviet people. Thus, when you hear the Russian foreign minister grasping at straws to call Zelensky a Nazi, and when you hear and read Russian state media arguing that Ukraine's hostility towards Russia makes them Nazi, or even worse than the Nazis, you understand that for Russia, Nazism has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Nazism and fascism are and have been whatever Russia considers to be hostile to it. Because to Russia, Nazism's greatest crime has always been attacking Russia. This is sickly ironic because the Russian military has been behaving in Ukraine with all of the bestial barbarity that people of the former Soviet Union have been taught made the Nazis so abhorrent and so loathsome. The message I want to leave you with is that the support Ukraine has gotten from the rest of the world matters. Not just the weapons, not just the money, but the confidence that the world is on our side, that the world stands against Russian aggression, and that as Ukrainians fight to expel the Russian invader from their lands, the goodwill of the world will be at their backs. The world's belief in the Ukrainian cause gives Ukrainians the confidence to know that the sacrifices they make for final victory will be worth it, and that victory will ultimately be theirs. As we say in Ukrainian, "Дякую вам величезно, слава Україні." Okay, I see a hand from Michael.
Good morning, Joel. First, I want to thank you for the very articulate and informative presentation. I'm glad that you and your girlfriend and your friends are safe. I had a question. Do you get the sense that in Ukraine, the average Ukrainian is content with returning to the status quo vis-a-vis Eastern Ukraine? Or do you get the feeling instead that they're bent on wresting Crimea and the Donbass back from the Russians?
The rhetoric that you hear is definitely in favor of bring it all back. What people's private opinions might be, I'm not sure. My personal opinion is that I fear that Ukrainian armed forces would enter Crimea and the self-proclaimed People's Republics, or at least the parts that were occupied since 2014, that they would enter those areas with Bucha fresh in their minds. And that would be a very ugly sight. I think that if the Ukrainians were to cross into Crimea or the occupied or the Donetsk Luhansk people, so-called Donetsk Luhansk People's Republic, they would encounter significantly stiffer resistance than they have, and more competent resistance than they've encountered from the Russians, because there are a whole lot of true believers there, believers in the fact that, oh, Ukraine is full of Nazis who want to come and kill them all. again, I personally think that a return to the February 23rd status quo would be, if I were Zelensky, that is an outcome I would accept. But I'm not fully confident that I'm able to speak for the Ukrainian people on that. There might be polling on this at some point, but yeah, there are a lot of people who want the whole country back. You walk down, if I walk down my street here, there's a coffee shop, which on their tip jar, it basically says, for vacation in our Crimea. So they believe in final victory, whatever that might mean. But I'm not sure what people, I'm not sure what most Ukrainians have in mind for final victory, other than the very least expelling all Russian forces back behind the lines of February 23rd.
Thank you.
Okay, who's next? D, I see you raising your hand. Please turn on your microphone.
Welcome home, so to speak. If I understood you correctly earlier, you spoke about not really getting as much help, particularly from here, or words to that effect. And you mentioned one organization that was noteworthy in its support. For those of us that have made donations, I for one, to the Jewish Federation, is that kind of money getting there? Or you mentioned after Shabbos contacting you, but if there are particular venues or organizations where you're very confident that our money's really getting there, that would be most helpful, because I know a number of us really want to support, and some of us have been hanging back because in a lot of these kinds of situations all over the world, when you send money, you never know where it's going to go. And then the other question I have, or that's a statement, the other question is, and I don't mean this to be disrespectful in any way, but in your travels back and forth, can you speak to the atrocities that seem to be leaking out? And is there anything in any of that that you think ultimately will draw those of us, meaning countries, into actual war? Because this, for what we're getting, it's horrific.
When it comes to support for organizations, I'm going to avoid asking for money out of respect for laws of Shabbat, which tell us not to deal in business on Shabbat. But the thing is that, for example, the Red Cross, for example, I've heard stories of the Ukrainian Red Cross doing a lot of good work and getting things to people where they're needed. The ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, I barely see them here. This is the biggest transit city for refugees out of the country. It's probably the biggest refugee hub for once people get to safety, and I haven't seen them. And I haven't seen much of them in the other Western cities that I traveled to. At one point, I was my girlfriend and I were traveling to this by road to the city of Kamenets-Podilsky, and that was the first time I had ever seen Red Cross aid trucks that had Geneva license plates. If you want to send support to organizations, I would send support to those organizations which had a pre-existing presence. There are Jewish organizations that have. I'm not specifically familiar with what the Joint Distribution Committee has been doing here, but I'm hopeful that they've been doing good work. But like I said before, the most potent activities are people just going out and doing like what Katya does and buying medicine, putting it in a box, and shipping it where it needs to go. Or, you know, contacting their people abroad, ordering bulletproof vests or night vision optics or tourniquets or hemostatic bandages or whatever, and just sending it. It's important to understand that Ukraine has experience with this. There was a similar mobilization during the opening chapters of the war in 2014, when the country all of a sudden had to defend itself. And, you know, people crowdfunded a significant portion of the country's defense. And people crowdfunded a lot of the refugee response. I would say that if you want to send money to support relief efforts, send it as close to the ground as you can get. And further, look me up on Facebook or talk to me after Shabbat.
Joel? Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about the perception of Zelensky's Jewishness and the significance of his Jewishness within Ukraine. And the reason that I ask that is certainly—
Can you step a bit closer to the microphone?
Yeah, okay, sorry. I wanted to ask about the perception and significance of Zelensky's Jewishness within Ukraine, okay? Because here in America, and particularly within the American Jewish press, you know, it's like a big deal. And I've even seen articles about Zelensky representing a new type of Jewish masculinity, right? Because of the stereotype of bookishness. And here is this guy who, on the one hand, loves his family and so on and so forth, but bravery and blah, blah. And so my question is, you know, to what extent do people in Ukraine realize that Zelensky is Jewish? And to what extent does it matter? And I would add, I watched the first season of his TV show, Servant of the People. And, you know, it was interesting. And we always watch things in the original language with subtitles. And there were bits and pieces of Yiddish in the conversation, his conversation with his dad, but they were never like explicitly Jewish, at least vis-a-vis the subtitles. So I guess that's my question. Like, what does Zelensky's Jewishness mean to people in Ukraine?
It's definitely been rediscovered. Zelensky never made his Jewishness a big part of his life as an entertainer. He played up stereotypes for some cheap jokes sometimes with his comedy troupe. He didn't make it a big part of himself in politics. He didn't make it a big part, especially big part of himself as an entertainer. And, you know, I think wisely so, because identifying as, you know, very outwardly Jewish, you know, Ukraine's a fairly tolerant country, but it's still Ukraine. But I mean, yeah, I think I've heard stories of people learning for the first time that he was indeed Jewish when the war started. I mean, it is often looked at as, you know, oh, well, of course we can't be Nazi. We have a Jewish president. Or of course the far right isn't that big a problem here. We have a Jewish president. There are some far right problems, but, you know, not significantly more than in the rest of Eastern Europe, and especially not worse than in Russia. But something that's important to understand here is that the celebration of Zelensky himself, almost this cult of personality that I've noticed in Western media coverage, simply does not exist in Ukraine. You don't see pictures of him put up in the windows, except in shops which are clearly for tourists. You know, people tune into his addresses, but whereas in Russia, Vladimir Putin is the system. And, you know, everybody either waits for his word or anxiously anticipates what his desires are. Zelensky is a replaceable component here. The Russians probably thought that, you know, the Russians are really kings of projection. And they thought that, you know, if they took out Zelensky, the country would fall. Even if they had succeeded in doing that, the country would still have put up massive resistance. Because they don't understand that Ukraine is a real country, and Zelensky is a real elected politician who is in his office because he won the most votes. You know, a lot of people weren't particularly approving of him before the war, but he was the choice that Ukraine made, and Ukrainians are standing behind him because he was the choice that they made. The fact that he stayed in Kyiv was big, because there were people in the military and security establishment, so I've heard, that were not inclined to stay. So the fact that he stayed was big. But I do think that Americans make considerably more of Zelensky's Jewish background than Ukrainians do. It's not that big a deal here, but I mean, of all the guys to have as president when the Russians were invading and trying to denazify your country, a Jewish guy was good to have.
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, let me scroll down to see if there are any other hands raised. Lloyd.
Yes, you were a student of Russia before coming to Ukraine.
Correct.
A lot of reports here that Putin is a very sick man. I don't know if those are true and have filtered to the Ukraine. And as you've alluded, that Putin is the Russian leader, and is not clear as to what the line of succession would be, resulting end game for this situation. And
there is no line of succession. I mean, there might be one officially outlined in the Constitution, but in reality, there is no line of succession. It's very possible that Putin could be quite ill, but you also have to understand that there is an information war going on. He doesn't look particularly healthy. But I mean, one of my favorite Russia scholars put it this way: you will not hear anything about about a coup or about Putin's demise otherwise until his body is in a bag and is outside of the Kremlin walls. And I think the fact that there is such chaos, that there is no alternative to Putin. But on the other hand, there is so much pressure on him not to lose this. It is what makes this a particularly dangerous situation for Ukraine, because yes, it does seem to me that Vladimir Putin cannot afford to lose the war. He might not have much choice in the matter, but and I'm sorry, D, you would ask also about the possibility of US entry or other countries' entry into the war. The United States has sat out wars. they sat out Syria. They sat out the events going on in Yemen. They've sat out a lot since the Cold War. And no, I do not believe that NATO or the United States would send forces into the fight, no matter what the humanitarian situation might be, because you don't cross swords with the nuclear armed state. Especially because, you know, Putin really can't afford to lose a war with NATO. And so the best available remedy to the humanitarian crises and to bring an end to the atrocities is the defeat of Russia on the battlefield by killing sufficient number of their soldiers, destroying a sufficient amount of their equipment, and torching a sufficient number of their supplies. In order for this to end, Ukraine will have to win on the battlefield, and it will have a whole lot of NATO weapons to do it, but it will be Ukraine doing the fighting.
Joel, thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us, and we appreciate everything that you're
Thank you very much for having me.
And you know, we pray that you and Katya and everybody and the cat remain safe, and that the war will end on a positive note fairly soon. Just on a tech note, if Lori or Leslie, you could stop the recording.